Hey, everybody, welcome to this next lesson in our series, Just Mercy, Justice, and the People of God. I hope by now, if you've been following along in this study, that you see just how important doing justice is to living the Christian life in the world. I don't think there's any of us that would disagree with that. I think we all agree that we should pursue justice and do justice as the Bible commands. The more challenging question and the subject of our class today is how exactly do we go about that? How should we do justice? And I want us to start by just thinking through something. I want to read Job 29, verse 14. This is where Job says, and this is one of those passages where these two words for justice and righteousness or justness are put together or paired in the Old Testament. Job says, I put on righteousness, that's tzedakah, justness, righteousness, justice, as my clothing. Justice, mishpat, was my robe and my turban. I put on righteousness as my clothing. Justice was my robe and my turban. Now, obviously, he's speaking metaphorically there, but what do you think he means? Well, I think he's speaking about a social consciousness that is just infused in his daily life. It's as completely as infused in his life as completely as the clothing that he wears that covers his body every single day. He shared his in the other parts of Job. When we looked at the Old Testament, Job shares about how he shared his money and food with the poor. He cared for the blind, the crippled, the poor widow. He was also a legal advocate for the immigrant and the offering. In other words, Job's vision of doing justice it was very comprehensive. When he says he wears justice, he's suggesting that it's always on his mind. It's always what he's thinking about, and he's always looking for ways to make justice happen. It's not just an occasional thing. It happens all the time. Psalm 41, verse 1 says, blessed is he who considers the poor. And that's an interesting word because the Hebrew word translated considers means to give sustained attention to a subject and then to act wisely and successfully with regard to it. So the point is that God didn't want us just to merely give the poor perfunctory help or maybe glance at them every now and then. He wants us to ponder long and hard and about how to improve their entire situation. Let me give you an example from Tim Keller's book, and this class is based largely on this book, Timothy Keller's Generous Justice: How God's Grace Makes Us Just. He tells the story of a man that he knows who's a Christian, but also owns a chain of car dealerships. And as usual, his salespeople this is the way car dealerships generally work. They're authorized to negotiate the price of cars or vehicles with their customers. But at one point, they did a study. Maybe the CFO, the chief financial officer, did some type of a study, and they discovered that in general, men were more persistent negotiators than women, and that white people pressed their interests more than black people did. Well, what that meant was that black women, who were often poorer, were paying more for cars than more prosperous customers. The dealership owner realized that his business practice took advantage of a class of people that needed help and protection. The practice wasn't illegal, and very few people would even have considered it immoral, but it ended up being exploitative. So the company changed the policy from one of negotiation to the list price. The list price is the price that people pay. Now, I don't think this would have occurred to most people, but this Christian businessman was considering the poor and seeking to integrate the doing of justice into every aspect of private and public life. Tim Keller asked him one time if this good business on his part. And he replied that there may be some future benefits for the company, but that would be minor and unquantifiable, and they didn't matter. He made the changes because he was not going to take advantage of people who were economically disadvantaged in his city. The Christian business owner was willing to permanently disadvantage his business if it meant doing justice. Now, how do you react to that? It tells me that doing justice requires constant, sustained reflection and alertness. We have to be looking for ways to do justice all the time in everything that we do. But the problem's it's so vast. It seems so intractable. Well, where do we even begin? Well, we start by realizing that there are that vulnerable people need there are several levels of help that are needed. One might be immediate relief. That's direct aid meant to meet immediate physical, material, and economic needs. That's what the Good Samaritan did for the man that was the Jewish man that was beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. Think about some of the common relief ministries you might already know of. Temporary shelters for the homeless and refugees, food and clothing services for people in need, maybe free or low-cost medical and counseling services. Their relief also means, caring for foster children, the elderly, the physically handicapped through home care or the establishment of institutions. That's a more assertive form. Another assertive form of relief is advocacy, in which people in need are given assistance to find legal aid and housing and other kinds of help, like protection from various forms of domestic abuse and violence. But immediate relief is something that they need right now. I think that's one of the things that our Loaves and Fishes ministry does here at Northside. We give immediate relief to homeless people. The next level of relief is what's called development, and that's helping people move from dependency to self-sufficiency, giving an individual or family or an entire community what they need to move beyond dependency on relief to a position of economic self-sufficiency. In Deuteronomy 15, we won't look at it again, but Deuteronomy 15, 13, and 14, it says that when a slave's debt was erased, when the law of release, the law of Jubilee, when a slave's debt was erased and he was released by his master, God instructed the master to send him out with sufficient grain and tools and resources for a new self-sufficient economic life. So, think of some of the things that could be provided to help people developmentally like that. Maybe financial counseling, or it could also include access to education, job creation, and job training, and job search skills, and legal assistance, and investment in job opportunities, and more and more. The idea is to do what you can to help the person or the family climb out of a state of constant dependency. Development, of course, is much more time-consuming and complex and expensive than mere immediate relief. And then there's another level, and that's social reform. Social reform moves beyond the relief of immediate needs and dependency, and it seeks to change the conditions or the structures, the social structures that aggravate or cause that dependency. Imagine if the parable of the Good Samaritan had a sequel. And months go by, and every time the Good Samaritan makes his trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, he finds another man on the road beaten and robbed. Well, finally, the Samaritan says, okay, what do we have to do? What do we have to do to change the violence? Stop the violence? How do we do that? That's what we're talking about when we're talking about social reform. The answer to that question has to be some type of social reform, instituting a new social arrangement to stop the flow of victims because of a change in social conditions. Well, like what? Well, it could be as simple as putting more police on the street. But another way to accomplish that goal would be to build bridges and coalitions between institutions that have not worked together previously, or maybe sometimes even worked against one another, bringing families and local churches and the police and city government and bringing those people together. This goes beyond just helping individuals. It seeks to change the social arrangements and the social institutions. In some cases, it means getting political and changing laws. There are city agencies. This is just true. There are city agencies that are not fair in attention and in the attention and resources they give to middle class and wealthy neighborhoods over poor ones. That just happens, where agencies favor the middle class or the wealthy over the poor. There are judges who take bribes. There are legislators who are bought by special interest money. There are banking policies that discriminate against neighborhoods, building code inspectors in the pocket of landlords, and real estate interests, and corruption within the law enforcement system. All that stuff happens. And to address and rectify some of those issues is to pursue social reform. Now, so you got immediate relief, development, and social reform. And let me share with you someone who's done all three very successfully. A man named John M. Perkins, who was born in 1930, still alive today. He founded ministries in both in rural and urban areas of Mississippi, as well as urban areas in Los Angeles. And his work was just amazing, what he's able to accomplish through the years. A variety of programs: daycare, farm co-ops, health centers, adult education centers, low-income housing development, tutoring, job training, youth internships, college scholarship programs. And I'll tell you this, he also vigorously pursued evangelism and new church planting. I mean, the liberals and nobody knew what to do with this guy. He was doing both ends of the spectrum. They didn't know how to treat him. And his philosophy of ministry basically involved three things. One was what was sometimes called reneighboring a community. And he advocated that those people who were going to help a community, it really was best if they lived in the community, because usually charities that were helping communities were removed from the community, so they didn't really know what was going on in the communities, and they couldn't really be held accountable. So he felt like their people needed to be in the neighborhood, and that really makes sense. When I was in Longview at the Pine Tree Church of Christ, we started something called the Caring and Sharing Center, which was across town. It was across town in the poor side of town. We rented a storefront, and people began to donate food and clothing, and we began to help people and listen to them to find out what the needs were. That's this kind of a thing, reneighboring. We didn't move there, which would have been probably the best thing to do, but that's the kind of thing that reneighboring means. He also talks about reweaving a community. And he would say there had to be a full range of measures that are designed to keep financial capital, business and jobs, and social capital, training and retraining local leadership, and spiritual capital, the moral influence of the churches, in the community, in the neighborhoods. What happens when a neighborhood becomes blighted? You have what we would call white flight. People leave and they go out to the suburbs, and the churches leave too. He says they need to hang in there. They need to stay there and work. And then the third thing he focuses on is racial reconciliation. His aim, and you need to read Tim Keller's book to get a better feel for this, but his aim was to bring white people and people of color together in partnership to alleviate suffering. He felt that the partnership with different races and social locations was one of the gifts of the gospel that the gospel created that we should use. And I'll tell you, the Bible provides deep resources for racial reconciliation. We may not recognize it because that's not really our thought process when we approach the Bible sometimes, but there are deep resources for racial reconciliation. Even the depiction of creation cuts the nerve of racism at its source. The account of Adam's creation is crucial for an understanding of race. God creates Adam, a human, and the Mishnah was the first major commentary of the Bible by Jewish Bible scholars. Okay, so the first major commentary on the Old Testament, and they said, why did God create only one human being? Well, that's so that no one can say to a fellow human being, my father was better than yours. We're all created in the image of God. We talked about that last week. Therefore, no one race is inherently superior to another. Now, Race and racism is built into the idea of justice and doing justice and uh, poverty. And I mean, we need to just pause for a moment and just talk about where does racism come from? Well, you may remember in Genesis chapter 11, there's a story about the Tower of Babel or Babel, depending on how you want to pronounce it, um, that people were on earth they were prideful and they were filled with a lust for power. And to punish them, God confused their speech. And so they couldn't understand each other and work together. And as a result, they scattered into the world, into the different nations. And the point of the story is this, that human pride and lust for power leads to racial and national division, to strife, and to hatred. The division into different groups with different languages was a consequence of human disobedience. And so, I mean, God wasn't going to give up on everybody. In the very next chapter, in Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abraham and says he's going to bless all the peoples of the earth. God is distressed that the unity of the human family has been broken, and he declares his intention to take down the walls of racism and nationalism that human sin and pride have put there. The New Testament completes the story. You go to Acts chapter 2, and the Holy Spirit descends on the apostles, and another miracle occurs. And while at Babel, people spoke the same language, couldn't understand each other. At Pentecost, everyone that spoke different languages could understand the preaching of the gospel from the apostles. This is a reversing of the curse of Babel. It was a declaration that the grace of Jesus can heal the wounds of racism. At Pentecost, this first gospel preaching was in every language, showing that no one culture is the right culture. No one nationality is the right nationality. That the Spirit can bring unity that transcends all national, linguistic, and cultural barriers. The result in Ephesians chapter 2 is that the church is full of, becomes a community of fellow citizens from all races, and partnership and friendship across racial barriers within the church is one of the signs of the presence of the power of the gospel, folks. Let me just say that again. Partnership and friendship as Christians across racial barriers within the church is one of the signs of the presence and power of the gospel. And then in the final chapter, the final book of the Bible, in Revelation, you see God, a time is envisioned, God is uniting people from every tribe and language and people and nation. Now, I want you to know that between the promises of Genesis 12 and the ultimate fulfillment in Revelation, the Bible attacks racism. It attacks racism. In Numbers 12, Moses' sister Miriam is punished for her racism because Moses married an Egyptian black woman, and Miriam didn't like that, and God punished her. Jonah, the story of Jonah, this was not about a man who was afraid to go preach in Nineveh. This story is about a man who hated Nineveh. He knew that if he preached in Nineveh, that the people would repent. He knew the power of God. And so he ran because he was a Jewish national, and and Nineveh was the sworn enemy of Israel. So he didn't want to go primarily because of race and politics. In Acts chapter 10, the Apostle Peter takes a vision and the conversion of Cornelius, the centurion, the Gentile centurion, for Peter to be taught the sinfulness of racial and ethnic bias. He says in Acts chapter 10, verses 34 and 35, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every nation the one who fears him and does what is right. You know what that word nation is in Greek? It's ethnos. He's saying, I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts from every ethnicity the one who fears him and does what is right. Sometime later, Paul saw Peter refusing to eat with Gentile Christians in Antioch, and he confronted him to his face, confronted his racism and his showing of favoritism. Listen, the racial prejudice is wrong because it's a denial of the very principle that every human being is equally sinful and equally saved by only the grace of God. And a deep grasp of the gospel of grace, Paul says, should erode our racial biases. What Christians have in common goes so much deeper than their cultural dissimilarities. And when this theology of grace and race permeates the consciousness of a Christian, a church, and a community, the resulting unity of relationships becomes both a means to reneighboring and reweaving and a direct witness to the world of the reality of the gospel. And the converse is also true. To the extent that we do not do that, everything breaks down. Well, let's try to put this all together. What can we do? Doing justice in poor communities includes direct relief and individual development, community development, racial reconciliation, social reform. What do we do? Well, I think we begin by trying to discover and understand the needs around us. Are there disadvantaged children around us? Are abused, neglected? Are they physically or mentally disabled? Are they failing in school? Who are there children that need help? Are there elderly or disabled or single parents or chronically ill people or new immigrants who need aid? What do we do? How do we do that? How do we go about discovering that? Well, one thing we can do is we can engage in a more sustained listening to our community leaders. What if we sat down with what if a delegation from Northside sat down with our city councilman, or we asked to visit with the mayor, and we sat down with them and said, we want to know what the needs are. Help us to understand the needs. We could also we could make some connections between churches and ministries that are resident, that is, that are in poor areas, and that are effective in poor neighborhoods. We could get with those folks and find out what they do and how can we partner with them. We can partner. And I didn't include this, but I would say we could also partner with ministries, the food bank, Christian assistance ministries. Some of you are involved in that already. But there are a lot of things that we could start talking about and start doing. There are a lot of people that don't believe that the church is supposed to be in the business of doing justice at all. That the only thing the church does is preach the word and evangelize and build others up. But if it's true that justice and mercy to the poor are the inevitable signs of justifying faith, which we talked about last week, and I think it is, it's hard to believe that a church is not to reflect this duty corporately in some way. Now, how we go about that is the big conversation, and we haven't answered the questions today, but it's something we need to start having conversations about. And as soon as you get in the lives of people, in evangelism as well as spiritual nurture, you're going to come upon people with practical needs, and you're going to have to try to help them. According to 1 John 3, verses 16 and 17, you can't love people in word only. You can't love people if you're doing evangelism and not meeting material needs. That's not how you love them. You have to do both. Doing justice, it requires striking a number of balances. It means ministering in both word and deed. It means ministering through the local church and as individual agents that are dispersed out into the world. It means engaging in relief, development, and reform. We do all this not only because we learn that from the Bible, that the causes of poverty are complex, but also because the gospel of Christ calls us to deeds of love and mercy. Well, next week we'll continue our study. Only a couple of lessons left. I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been challenging for me, and I hope it's been challenging for you. And we will see you next week. God bless.